Yes, a logical question at this point is, why is rote learning prevalent, and what is the cause of rote learning that is so widely seen in our schools? And one can speculate. I mean, there are some reasons and there are some current reasons, and we can speculate on some of the historical reasons. But typically, not just in India but around the world, historically education has been about, one, it was always initially, you could say, about religious education. And religious education, especially in the past, involved the scriptures, and it involved learning those scriptures typically by heart, so literally by memorization or by rote. There was not that much to be understood. You were not sent to a religious school to be understanding the scriptures as much as to be learning to recite the scriptures. So in a sense, the history of education did involve students going to a place where there was somebody who knew the material, who would often make the children repeat it, and then when children were able to recite it, this was considered that they had learned. So that's probably a history of rote learning. But if this alone was true, if this is all there was to the story, then we would probably find that this would be the situation all over the world with no change. And while that is true to a certain extent, there are a lot of indications that the extent of rote learning in India is actually very high, and it's something which is troubling. In fact, I'm not going to compare with the nations that are actually doing well in education. We talk of countries like Singapore, Korea, Finland, and others at times. I'm not going to compare with them. But there was a study that has been recently published which looked at rote learning and the questions in the exams, in the school leaving exams, in 4 countries. And these countries were Nigeria, Uganda, India, and Pakistan. None of them have very high levels of learning. These are countries with relatively lower levels of learning. But the surprising finding for us in India is that the study found that the extent of rote learning, or the extent to which the questions asked were mechanical, was actually the highest in India and Pakistan, and it was actually much lower even in countries like Nigeria and Uganda, where too the learning was not particularly high. And this brings us to the question of, why is it that rote learning continues to be very entrenched in India today, and probably less so in other countries? And that is the fact that our board exams, the school leaving exams in the 10th and the 12th, are actually perpetrating this kind of rote learning through the type of questions that they ask. So if you look at board exam papers, you will find that the questions that are asked are typically of this kind, where you have to kind of either repeat something which was there in the textbook, often a fact which is not very critical, what we would call a trivial fact. And even in other questions in subjects like mathematics, you're kind of using a procedure which you have used on a question type that you're more or less familiar with. So you kind of prepare for it, and then you get something very similar in the exam, and then you solve that. If you're now given a question that requires you to apply this learning elsewhere, to think about it, to write something creative based on something you have learned, that is where children tend to struggle. And this is because the exam has questions in this form. This defines, because once the exam in grade 10 is of this form, schools will have similar formats in grade 8 to prepare for that. The teachers in grade 5 will do something similar so that they are ready for grade 8, and this kind of has a downstream effect and kind of encourages or increases rote learning throughout the system. The positive of it, of course, is that if we had to make changes here, a board exam reform and changing the kind of questions we ask in this itself can make a huge impact here. And this is not just me or some of us saying it. In 2005-2006, when the National Curricular Framework was developed, there were a group of focus papers that kind of went deep into specific areas. And the focus group that went into examination reform, and a very eminent panel that kind of gave this report, and it is there on the NCERT site, and you can read this report, actually talked about this part in a pretty major way. And it talked only about, it said that while we have done other kinds of reform in board exams, the kind of questions we are asking in our board exams have not changed. And they have given a number of examples of questions from different board exams across the country. And one that I remember, and I will give an example here, is a question in one of the state board exams which said, give the names of the parents of Benito Mussolini. So Mussolini was this Italian politician who is known as the person who started fascism, and around World War II. But the name of his parents might have been mentioned in the textbook as part of his life story, that he was the son of so and so people. But it's a completely irrelevant and trivial fact, because the important thing about Mussolini is his role in world history, his role in fascism, and how that affected World War II and so on. And instead, if you ask for the name of the parents, you're not encouraging children's ability to think and understand these forces, but you're actually forcing them to, if I may say so, memorize trivial facts that are not really important. So that is a major problem, and probably the cause for rote learning, and something that kind of defines learning, and a problem that we would need to look at and try and change as we go along.